General Hospital spoilers reveal that Scout Kane had spent weeks living with a kind of fear that crawled beneath her skin. A fear too heavy for someone her age to name, yet impossible for her to ignore. Ever since the night Drew was shot, she had carried something inside her that felt like a knot tightening. Every time anyone mentioned the investigation, every time she saw her father flinch, every time she overheard adults whisper in the next room. She wasn't supposed to remember anything. She wasn't supposed to know anything. She was supposed to have been safe at camp, far away from danger. But memory, for a child, is a strange and slippery thing. It hides what is unbearable and reveals what is unavoidable. And now, as the world around her twisted itself into chaos, Scout found herself unable to run from the truth that pressed against her thoughts. With suffocating urgency, she knew something. She remembered something. Something that could destroy her family if she kept it inside any longer. Something that could destroy her even faster if she said it out loud. But the weight of silence had grown to unbearable. Scout wanted to end the nightmare not just for herself, but for everyone drowning in the fallout of that night. She convinced herself that confessing was the only way to stop the spinning madness surrounding the investigation. Every time she saw Michael tense when Drew's name came up, every time she caught Trina and Kai exchanging haunted glances, every time she felt Danny watching her with an expression that made her chest ache, she felt the pressure intensify. Everyone was hurting. Everyone was scared. Everyone was waiting for the truth, but no one could reach it. And so Scout, the smallest voice in the room, decided that she would be the one to shatter the silence. She would confess, take the blame, and give everyone the closure they so desperately needed, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. But the truth, the real truth, was far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more tragic than she understood. Scout believed she had been the one who pulled the trigger. She believed it because she remembered the anger. She remembered the fear. She remembered the argument she'd had with Drew. The feeling of betrayal that had swelled so large inside her that she could barely breathe. She remembered holding the gun. She remembered crying. She remembered wanting everything to stop. But when she pressed deeper into those fragments, another memory surfaced, a memory she had pushed away for weeks because it didn't make sense. Because it contradicted the story she had been telling herself. Because it scared her more than anything else. She wasn't alone that night. She wasn't the only one in the room. She wasn't the one who fired the weapon. Charlotte Casadini had been there. At first, the memory came only in flashes, a shadow behind her. A voice whispered to Loda, understand, a hand touching her shoulder. A familiar scent of expensive perfume. A glimpse of cold determination in Charlotte's eyes. Scout tried to bury those flashes, tried to convince herself they weren't real, tried to force them back into the fog where they came from. But the past has a way of clawing forward when the truth is ready to be revealed. The more Scout tried to take responsibility, the more clearly she remembered the way Charlotte had grabbed the gun from her trembling hands. She remembered Charlotte saying they had to fix this, that grown-ups didn't understand, that Drew deserved it for what he had done. She remembered being frozen in place, too terrified to stop her cousin. She remembered the deafening crack, the moment the world split in half. She remembered Charlotte dragging her out of the room before she could even process what had happened. And then she remembered the silence, Charlotte's warning stare, her whispered threat cloaked as sisterly protection. The way she promised Scout that everything would be okay if she just didn't say a word. Now, with the truth pushing itself violently back into Scout's mind, the little girl stood on the edge of a cliff she could not escape. She wanted the suffering to end. She wanted to tell the adults everything. She wanted the weight to stop crushing her chest. But the minute she tried to open her mouth, she realized she no longer knew what she was confessing to. Was she taking responsibility for something she wished she had done? For something she believed she had caused? Was she shielding Charlotte? Was she protecting herself? The lines blurred, tangled into a nightmare she couldn't untie. She was a child caught between guilt and truth, between loyalty and fear, between what she remembered and what she wished she didn't. Scout began to craft her confession carefully. She rehearsed it silently while lying awake in the dark, while brushing her hair in the morning, while staring at her father's bruised face and trying not to cry. She thought if she admitted she was the one who pulled the trigger, everything would finally stop. People would stop whispering. The investigation would end. The guilt would have a name, and she could finally breathe again. She even imagined Drew forgiving her, telling her he understood, holding her in his arms so tightly she couldn't fall apart anymore. But every time she tried to speak, the memory of Charlotte's face rose before her, the cold calculation in her eyes, the way she smiled afterward as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. And that smile terrified Scout more than anything else. Because if Charlotte had really been the one to shoot Drew, then Scout wasn't just lying to protect herself, she was trying to confess. To protect someone far more dangerous. Charlotte Casadini had always been unpredictable. always teetering on the edge of something darker than any child should carry. But the idea that she had crossed such a line, that she had used Scout's fear and confusion to hide her own act of violence, made Scout's skin crawl. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to expose her cousin. They shared secrets, blood, bonded chaos that only Casadini children seemed to understand. Scout knew that betraying Charlotte meant unleashing a storm she couldn't control, a storm that could tear their entire family apart. But the storm was already coming. Trina and Kai were closing in on the truth. Michael was growing too quiet, too protective, too burdened by something he wasn't saying. Alexis was unraveling. Jason was sharpening into a weapon. Dante was sensing the cracks forming in every direction. And Scout knew deep down that if she didn't speak soon, the truth would explode on its own terms, destroying everyone in its path. So she made her choice. A choice only a child trapped in a world of adult mistakes could make. She would confess. She would claim the responsibility. She would shield Charlotte. She would take the fall to stop the spiral. After all, how much worse could things get? But Scout didn't understand that her confession wouldn't end the chaos, it would ignite a new one. Because her story didn't align with the evidence. Because her memories, fragmented and raw, didn't match the trajectory of the bullet. Because the investigation was already circling around the Casadinis. Because Charlotte's fingerprints were already closer to discovery than Scout realized. And because the moment Scout uttered her confession, the adults would stop seeing her as a child and start seeing her as the epicenter of a nightmare. The disaster had already begun. Scout didn't start it. Charlotte didn't end it. But Scout's confession, wrapped in fear, guilt, and misguided loyalty, would become the spark that set poor Charles on fire. And once the truth started unraveling, no one, not Scout, not Charlotte, not Drew, not Michael, not Alexis, not Jason, would be able to control what came next. The latest shift unfolding, and poor Charles hit with the force of a tremor, shaking loose a truth no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone now had to confront. The PCPD had officially launched a search for Charlotte Casadini, after new evidence indicated she had been abducted by Sidwell. What had started as a complex investigation into Drew's shooting suddenly opened into something far more volatile, a collision of danger, guilt, and childhood trauma spiraling beyond anyone's control. For weeks, Scout and Charlotte had been dancing on the edge of a secret they were too young to carry. A secret rooted in fear, loyalty, and a moment of violence that neither of them fully understood. But now, with Charlotte missing, that secret had transformed into a ticking bomb threatening to explode across every corner of Port Charles. The adjustment gripping the storyline wasn't merely logistical or procedural, it was psychological. It forced the adults to rethink everything they believed about the two girls. It forced the girls themselves to confront the consequences of choices they had tried so desperately to hide. Scout had spent nights twisting under the weight of guilt, convinced she had caused the chaos that now consumed her family. Charlotte, before disappearing, had begun cracking under her own fear, her carefully curated Casadini composure slipping away as a reality of what she'd done grew harder to escape. And now that Sidwell had intervened, now that he had taken her, not even Charlotte's darkest secrets could shield her anymore. The PCPD's hunt for Charlotte became a frantic race against a man whose motives were still unknown. A man whose ties to the Casadinis ran deeper than anyone had realized. If Sidwell had taken Charlotte to silence her, then he likely knew the truth about Drew's shooting. If he had taken her to manipulate her, then he understood just how fragile the girl's psyche had become. And if he had taken her because he believed she was dangerous, then the implications were even more frightening. But regardless of Sidwell's intentions, one thing was painfully clear: Scout and Charlotte were no longer just children caught in the storm. They were becoming the eye of it. Scout felt the shift immediately. As soon as she learned Charlotte was missing, her world constricted into something tight and suffocating. The guilt she had been trying to bury surged inside her like a rising tide. She couldn't breathe without feeling responsible. She couldn't think without hearing Charlotte's voice echoing in her mind. She couldn't look at Drew, Jason, or Alexis without believing she had failed to stop something terrible from happening. And the worst part, the part that haunted her most, was the understanding that Charlotte hadn't deserved this. No matter what either of them had done that night with the gun, Charlotte hadn't deserved to be taken by someone like Sidwell. Charlotte, too, before her disappearance, had begun to unravel. She carried the Casadini name like a shield. But beneath that veneer was a girl torn apart by fear and confusion. Her actions the night Drew was shot had not been born of cruelty, but of desperation and desire to protect Scout, to protect herself, to retaliate against a world she believed was hurting the people she loved. But intention didn't erase consequence. And deep down, Charlotte had known that the truth would eventually demand payment. When Sidwell came for her, his shadow stretching through the Casadini mansion like a cold hand, Charlotte understood that payment had arrived sooner than she expected. The adults believed they were dealing with two frightened girls who had gotten into deep. But that assessment barely scraped the surface of what Scout and Charlotte were truly facing. The trauma of the night. Drew's shot had bound them together in a way neither of them could articulate, an unspoken pact. A shared secret, a connection forged in fear. They were not just witnesses or participants. They were survivors of a moment that had fractured their sense of self. And now, with Charlotte missing and Scout drowning beneath the weight of responsibility, the obsession consuming them was no longer just emotional, it was existential. Scout wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to scream it. She wanted to break the silence that had become her prison. But Charlotte's disappearance changed everything. Scout understood that revealing the truth now wouldn't save anyone. It would destroy Charlotte's reputation. It would trigger a legal storm she wasn't ready to face. And worst of all, it would make her the last thread connecting Charlotte to that terrible night. Sidwell could use that. Sidwell would use that. And Scout couldn't bear the thought of being the reason Charlotte never came home. Meanwhile, the PCPD searched every warehouse, every dock, every abandoned property with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. Dante led the charge, torn between his duty as an officer and his fractured loyalty to the Casadini and Corinthos spheres. He understood better than anyone that children who carried secrets were children in danger. Danger from others, danger from themselves. And the thought of Charlotte alone with Sidwell, unprotected, terrified him in ways he couldn't express. The Casadini family responded with its usual cocktail of rage and denial, convinced this was an attack on their legacy as much as on their bloodline. But beneath their outrage, fear festered, fear that Charlotte's disappearance was not random, fear that it was punishment, fear that it was connected to the darkness Victor and Helena had left behind. The Corinthos and Quartermain families, meanwhile, found themselves pulled into the vortex of responsibility. Scout's unraveling was becoming impossible to hide. Her nightmares grew sharper. Her silence grew heavier. Her guilt became visible to anyone who looked too closely. And while they tried to comfort her, to reassure her, to protect her, none of them realized that Scout was holding the key to everything they were searching for. Not just the truth about Drew's shooting, but the truth about Charlotte's disappearance. Because if Scout told the truth, if she revealed that Charlotte had been the one to fire the gun, then the entire investigation would shift. Sidwell's motive would become obvious. The danger would escalate, and the fragile identity Charlotte had tried to rebuild would shatter beyond repair. Scout wasn't just protecting Charlotte out of fear, she was protecting her out of loyalty, love, and a child's desperate desire to fix what she had helped break. But secrets, especially the darkest ones, have a way of growing teeth, and as the search for Charlotte intensified, as Sidwell's intentions began to bleed into focus, as Scout's internal turmoil reached a dangerous breaking point, one truth became undeniable. The girls were no longer able to outrun their actions. The shooting, the silence, the guilt, the lies, all of it was unraveling too fast, too violently, too publicly. Even if Charlotte was found alive, she would never escape the psychological aftermath. Even if Scout stayed silent, the truth would claw its way to the surface. And even if the adults tried to shield them, the trauma had already marked them both in ways that would echo through Port Charles for years. This was no longer a story about a shooting. No longer a story about a kidnapping. No longer a story about two girls making a terrible mistake. This was the beginning of a new darkness. A darkness that tied Scout and Charlotte together. A darkness that Sidwell would exploit. A darkness the PCPD could not yet fully see. And a darkness that would soon swallow far more than anyone expected. The moment the final decision came down that Drew, Willow and Alexis would not be able to prosecute the person responsible for shooting Drew, the entire fragile structure of hope surrounding the case collapsed like a dying star, pulling everyone closest to it into a gravity of despair they had no way to escape. It wasn't merely a legal failure or a procedural dead end. It was a psychological fracture that spread through the family in quiet, devastating waves. Drew had walked into the process believing justice would eventually find its way through the chaos, that the truth would solidify, that the system would correct itself. But what he received instead was a hollow verdict that left him suspended between anger and helplessness. Willow tried to hold him together, tried to remind him that not every wound was healed through punishment, but even she could feel the shift, the dark adjustments settling over their lives like a shadow. That refused to lift. And Alexis, who had fought harder than anyone to bring clarity to the investigation, found herself staring into a void where resolution should have been, unable to admit that the failure wasn't due to lack of effort, but due to the horrifying truth that the shooter was far younger, far more fragile, and far closer to home than any of them were prepared to confront. Because the story didn't end with the case closing, it began with what came after. Scout, whose small shoulders had been carrying the unbearable weight of guilt, fear and silence, now stood at the center of a decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire childhood. The authorities had ruled that she could not be tried as an adult, nor could the family pursue prosecution after the full truth of her involvement came to light. But that did not spare her from consequence. The ruling that Scout would be sent away to a juvenile rehabilitation facility far from Port Charles, far from her home, far from Danny, far from the only family she had ever truly known, hit Drew and Willow with the force of a tragedy they never imagined they would face. It wasn't just the loss of justice now. It was the loss of their daughter's innocence, the loss of the future they thought she would have, the loss of the possibility that things could simply return to normal if they fought hard enough. The adjustment unfolding in their lives took on a new form of slow, suffocating realization that everything they believed about their family was shifting beneath them. Drew had once thought his worst injury was the bullet lodged in his body, but now he realized the true wound was emotional, deeper, harder to heal. The idea that his own child Scout, his quiet, observant little girl, had become entangled in the violence that nearly ended his life, was something he could not easily comprehend. Even if she had not physically pulled the trigger, even if Charlotte had been the one who fired the shot, Scout's involvement, the silence, the fear, the loyalty that twisted into self-destruction was enough to shatter him. He replayed every moment he had raised his voice, every time he had tried to discipline her, every argument, every misunderstanding, searching desperately for the moment he might have pushed her too far or made her feel too small. But the truth was far more complicated than anything he could piece together. Willow tried to be strong, tried to be the bridge between Drew's grief and Scout's unraveling, but she herself was drowning beneath the emotional weight. She had already lived through more trauma than many adults, had fought her way through illness and loss and fear, and she believed she understood pain. But this, watching Scout pack belongings into a small government tissue duffel bag, watching officials explain what would happen next, watching her daughter's eyes go hollow with resignation, this broke something inside her. She could not hold back the feeling that she had failed Scout somehow, that she had not protected her, not guided her, not seen her slipping toward a darkness she didn't understand. And every time she looked at Drew, she saw the same guilt mirrored in his expression, deepening the fracture between them in ways neither of them knew how to repair. Alexis, meanwhile, found herself in a storm of her own making. She had tried to navigate this nightmare through the lens of the law, believing justice, order and logic could straighten the twisted lines of the story. But the truth had slipped through her fingers like smoke. When she realized Scout would not face criminal charges, Alexis felt both relief and a strange, crushing guilt. She had fought so fiercely to determine the truth, yet the truth itself had become a curse. She knew Scout needed help, not handcuffs, rehabilitation, not retribution. But watching Scout being escorted away, hearing the sterile language of temporary placement and behavioral evaluation, Alexis felt her chest tighten with a fear she could not excuse. She had spent so many years trying to protect the children around her, Sam's, Christina's, Molly's, yet here she was, again powerless before a system that didn't heal hearts, only redirected brokenness. And in the midst of all of this, Scout's own world was collapsing in ways no adult could fully see. The decision to send her away came from a place of protection, rehabilitation and structure. But to Scout, it felt like exile. She had tried to shield Charlotte. She had tried to shield Drew. She had tried to shield herself. But the truth had proven heavier than her small body could carry. She remembered everything, the fear, the noise, the confusion, the loyalty she didn't know how to question, and now, with her departure looming, she felt as though she was being punished not only for her actions, but for the secrets she had been forced to protect. She wanted to confess, wanted to explain everything, wanted to scream that she had never meant for any of this to happen. But the words tangled in her throat, choked by shame and the memory of Charlotte's trembling hands. The adults didn't know that Scout had been replaying the night of the shooting. Every time she closed her eyes, they didn't know that she woke in the middle of the night hearing the crack of the gun, feeling the cold weight of responsibility pressing against her chest. They didn't know that she wished she had spoken sooner, wished she had refused to hide, wished she had found the courage to be a child instead of a protector. They didn't know because Scout didn't know how to tell them. And now it was too late. The absence of prosecution did not bring peace. The legal failure did not create closure. Sending Scout away did not fix what was broken at the core of their family. Instead, each decision, each revelation, each new adjustment only widened the emotional chasm between them all. Drew found himself drifting into silence, unable to reconcile his love for Scout with the fear that he had somehow become a stranger to his own daughter. Willow felt the foundations of their family home tilt beneath her, turning every quiet moment into a reminder of what they were losing. Alexis felt the past tightening its grip around her as she watched another child she loved become swallowed by trauma, and Scout, small, terrified, and trying so desperately to be brave, felt herself fading from the world she once belonged to. No one said it aloud, But they all felt it. This was only the beginning of a new kind of disaster. Not the kind that comes with bullets or kidnappings or criminals lurking in the shadows. This was the emotional kind, the slow-burning kind. The kind that rewrites childhoods and reshapes families in ways they may never fully recover from. Scout's departure was not just a sentence. It was a fracture. And the shattering had only begun.